You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On this week's episode, we welcome back Jade Saab, a Lebanese-Canadian scholar, for his second time on Radio Free Humanity, where he gives us an update on the political situation in Lebanon since the ammonium nitrate explosion on August 4th of this year. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In just a moment, we will begin our conversation with Jade Saab about the political situation in Lebanon. But first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes for Andrew and I to talk about some current events. So we are recording this current events section on Monday, October 5th, although we don't release it until Friday of this week. Just a few days ago, Trump announced that he had COVID. And we've all been following this story, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Although who knows what the situation will be like by Friday. He could be dead by then, or he could be back to quote-unquote normal by then.
October 2nd was my birthday.
Oh, and happy birthday.
My wife was just coming to bed, and it was 1:55 in the morning. You know, that woke me up, her coming to bed. She didn't want to tell me. 1 second after I wake up, she says, Trump's got COVID. And it was like the best birthday present I ever had.
So we don't know what the situation is going to be like on Friday when the podcast comes out, but we also don't even know what the situation is like right now, because there have been so many contradictory statements from doctors and Trump spokespeople and from Trump in his tweets. He's staging these ridiculous photo ops. We don't know when he got sick. We don't know how sick he's gotten. We don't know how much the virus has spread. And it's all because of him, because of the sort of insanity that is Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. There's right now about a dozen people who have a positive diagnosis from inside the White House, or people who were there where Amy COVID Barrett got nominated at that ceremony. And given how Trump runs things, where he's the hub and everything emanates from him, it's very likely that that's the spread of the coronavirus in this case as well. It's not a normal White House that works in a normal way. You know, he's the center of everything.
And we don't know how far the virus has spread from this super spreader event that is Trump. We know of the high-profile Republican figures who've come forward to say they have COVID, but because the administration is not doing real contact tracing around Trump's movements in the past week, we don't know how many other people have been exposed at fundraisers, from the people that go to them to the people who just work at them, like caterers and bodyguards and janitorial staff. But putting aside the horror that is irresponsible behavior leading to the super spreader events, it has been fun to see Trump sidelined by this thing. And it's also been interesting to see how various people in the media and politics have had to respond to this. Obviously, a lot of us will be happy if Trump just died tomorrow, but not everyone can just come out and say that.
And then there are the hardliners, and I'm not the only one, who say, no, we can't let him die. He has to be arrested, stand trial, and do his time for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I know, but I just have so much anxiety about this election. I'd be happy for him to die tomorrow and just get this whole thing over with. But then obviously there are people in the media or people in politics who, because of their position, can't just come right out and say, yeah, I hope he dies. The political fallout for them doing so would just be counterproductive. People like Joe Biden, right? He has to say something like, oh, I'm praying for the president, and even pulled his negative ads, which maybe was a little bit over the top. But there's a real strategic reason for him doing that. And obviously there's a double standard. If Biden was the one with COVID, Trump would be going at him with both barrels and not respecting the situation at all.
If you think you've got the anti-Trump vote nailed down and that you're going, for some insurance points, run up the board a bit with the Republicans who are wavering, then you do it the way that Biden's doing it.
So one of the people opining on this topic this week was Glenn Greenwald, who wrote a piece in The Intercept on October 4th called, "Why Are Democrats Praying for the Speedy Recovery of a, quote, Fascist Dictator?"
Basically, Greenwald's conceit here, it's right there in the first sentence. Quote, the typical reaction to the death of a tyrant is not one of grief and sadness, but joyous celebration. It's not hard to understand why. Blah, 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 blah. Yet, in the US, a radically different dynamic is playing out. The overwhelming reaction in those mainstream precincts to the news that the fascist dictator has contracted a potentially lethal virus is to hope and pray that he makes a speedy recovery whereby he can resume his democracy-destroying, genocidal, tyrannical fascist rule. He's trying to be sarcastic there. And what he means by mainstream precincts is the Democratic Party politicians and journalists like Rachel Maddow.
So basically his argument is that, look, these people were never serious when they said Trump was a fascist in the first place, because now they say they're praying for him.
Right. He speculates at the end. He calls himself a journalist, but he has like this totally unfounded speculation on motives. And one is that these Democratic politicians, I guess he considers Rachel Maddow, journalist, Democratic politician. One possibility he speculates is that they've ascended to a state of spiritual elevation whereby they're capable of praying even for what they believe to be fascists. And the one I think he really wants everybody to believe, may even believe himself, is the one he ends on. They don't really believe the things they've been saying about Trump and fascism and historical evil. That's all been for political advantage. He's still one of them. They see him as one of them, and they intend to rehabilitate and honor him once he's out of power. I'm reading, right? That's what he says. Then there's the explanation he begins with, which seems to be like, well, it's kind of what you said, Brendan, and it seems like obvious. Democratic leaders are pretending to be hoping for Trump's well-being for political purposes, while secretly hoping that he suffers and dies. Or I guess, people like myself, hoping that he lives and survives and is arrested, goes on trial, and spends the rest of his days at hard labor. It seems to me to be the most likely explanation, and since Greenwald has no evidence to the contrary, this just seems to be another attempt to take every possible thing they managed to twist out of all proportion and make it a way to blame the Democratic Party and people like Rachel Maddow, and thereby to further enable Trumpism.
Which takes us to the October 1st editorial that MHI released a few days ago called Trumpism, Democracy, and How to Vote from the Left. And it starts with this very issue of parts of the left that can only focus on fighting the Democrats as their main enemy, even in the face of the gigantic threat that is Trumpism at this very moment. We talk about the dangers of this way of thinking, and we urge people to put aside their personal sense of political identity or political brand and to think about what's good for the mass of people who are suffering under Trumpism. I mean, there is no wiggle room here. If Trump wins a second term, it's the end of so many things. The end of liberal democracy in America. It's our last chance to do something about the environment. It's the end for the fight against COVID. It will be an unmitigated disaster if he wins a second term. So we say, look, people, it's not about you. People have to vote for Biden. Even if you don't live in a swing state, we need massive voter turnout for Biden. And people need to be ready to take to the streets to protect this election. That's the short version. We hope listeners will read it carefully, write in, respond to it, share it, etc.
Yeah, and it has a couple of images in the editorial. One was designed for us. It shows a devastated city. It's being devastated by the death of democracy, people dead from coronavirus, and there's all kinds of dead fish floating in the water, people devastated by being shot by cops, and somebody there in the middle of the dead fish, the shirt that says, "I'm voting Mickey Mouse, so the whole world will see how much I hate both the Republicans and the Democrats." And people, when you go into the voting booth or you do a ballot by mail, no one sees it. It's a secret ballot. You're not making any kind of political statement at all, okay, by voting what you believe. The whole world doesn't see it. You have to think about the consequences of your actions. And you have to think strategically. Brendan, this is like kind of second nature for us, thinking about politics, in terms of consequences and strategically, because we're politically active people, but I think that it might be just hard for people who don't have that kind of activist orientation and engagement, it might be hard for people to think about politics in terms of what you can accomplish rather than here I'm expressing myself or here's what I believe. So I guess I have a certain empathy for that, although it doesn't really come quite naturally.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk a lot about in the editorial is the importance of mass movements. Voting for Biden in itself is not going to crush Trumpism or solve all the pressing social problems we have right now. Mass movements will do that, but voting for Biden is a tactic at this moment that's necessary for those movements to have room to grow. Under a second Trumpist regime, we're going to have so much state repression, and there's no path forward. I mean, already scientists are saying that, if Trump wins a second term, it's like over for the fight against climate change. We're pretty much doomed. So this is like a crucial tactic that has to be done right now. And we're probably going to need mass movements, people to come out in the streets just to protect this election because Trump is going to try to undermine it every way he can.
Right, and those demonstrations are not for Biden's sake. They will be for our sake. They will be for the sake of our democratic rights to elect what the majority of people want. We don't really have that right in this country, even, if there are no underhanded moves. And these are demonstrations really for our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's a widely held sentiment amongst a lot of people who are choosing to vote for Biden or who are thinking about demonstrating to protect this election. They're not just like centrist Democratic liberals or neoliberal shills or sort of these apolitical lemmings who can't think for themselves. They're people that understand what's at stake. They're concerned about their own personal safety and well-being and the future of the planet and the future of their family and children. And they know we cannot survive anymore under a Trumpist presidency. But that is all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, our main segment and conversation with Jade Saab about events in Lebanon. We are very pleased to welcome back Jade Saab to Radio Free Humanity today. We're recording this interview on September 11th of 2020, and we last spoke to Jade back in December of 2019 about the then somewhat new protest movement in Lebanon. And we wanted to have him back on the podcast today to give us an update on what's been going on in Lebanon, especially since the explosion last month. Jade Saab is a Lebanese-Canadian writer and activist. He's doing a PhD at the University of Glasgow in ideology and the process of socialist revolutions. He has a forthcoming book with Daraja Press titled A Region in Revolt that explores the most recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. So, Jade, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
Real briefly, your book, you said the most recent uprisings. So what uprisings are you writing about in the book?
Yeah, so we're actually covering the ones that started at the end of 2018 up to pretty much the middle of this year. So it's very kind of recent in terms of what it covers. And the book itself, it's a collection of works, and it's divided into 5 essays or chapters, each dealing with a specific country. The countries we deal with in no specific order are Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. So it's focusing on both historical aspects of the recent uprisings and kind of tracing it back historically, while also highlighting the actors on the ground as well as the character of these uprisings. Most chapters deal with the questions, do we call them uprisings? Do we call them revolutions? So yeah, that's kind of the idea of the book.
Well, we will include a link to the book in the podcast description so listeners can find it there. But let's jump into talking about Lebanon. Lebanon was back in the international spotlight again in August, on August 4th, when a huge explosion ripped through Beirut, killed 190 people, injured 6,500 people, leveled part of Beirut, caused $10 to $15 billion of property damage, left 300,000 people homeless. And it came out within a day or two that this ammonium nitrate that exploded was being stored in the port for the last 6 years, and that members of government knew about this and did nothing to dispose of the ammonium nitrate or warn people. They'd just been keeping it in this major metropolitan center. I can only begin to imagine what sort of emotions people in Lebanon must be going through right now. What's the mood on the street?
It's still a disbelief and shock. I mean, yeah, it's something worth highlighting is that as more details come out, and as details almost immediately turned out that the ammonium nitrate that caused this explosion has been stored unsafely in the port since 2014. So essentially, residents have been living, next to one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history for that many years is still something we all know that the government in Lebanon is inept and corrupt, but this took it to what I'm calling a transition from slow violence to fast violence. To instead of just slow economic starvation, you have literally close to 200 people being killed almost instantly due to government action and government inaction. And as details came out that pretty much everyone within the ruling class and within the government knew about this, and there were reports from the army several years ago warning about not just the danger of storing this ammonium nitrate, but the degraded state in which it's been stored, which really heightens volatility. Not to mention that it was stored in the same warehouse where fireworks were found. So it's just a multitude of issues. And then to add to that, after the explosion, there was a military state of emergency that was enacted, and the port became under the control of the Lebanese army. Just a few days ago, another massive fire broke out in another hangar very close to where the hangar that exploded, this time damaging a lot of the humanitarian aid that has been coming into the country from the Red Cross. So this is just a few days ago. So it is, needless to say, this has made the mood, everyone is on edge. Everyone is very frustrated. Yesterday, there was a video going around on social media of children in the near, close to where the port is, in total kind of panic, crying to be removed from the city because just over a month ago they had experienced the horrible explosion. So you're talking about a city in complete shock, a city dealing with trauma. It's pretty bleak to say the least. And then somehow there's still the expectation that it's going to get worse, as the government may very well move to remove subsidies from essential items such as fuel and food.
And that's in response to the ongoing financial crisis?
Exactly, yeah. So that's as part of their panic to try and get international aid into the country and to try and just reduce the government deficit, which, even if they took this small step, is nowhere close to being a solution.
So the explosion also damaged these grain silos or what have you on the port, right?
Yeah, so the strategic grain reserve, the country's strategic grain reserve, was right next to the hangar that exploded, and it's kind of the really prominent building or structure that you can see in all the pictures of the port. They were the grain silos there, so those have been completely lost, and this comes on top of reports earlier in the year saying that we might be dealing with essentially a famine, with the death of children due to starvation by the end of this year. So it is the infrastructure, the damage of this explosion is not just in the loss of life, but in a country that has 80% of imports, and the port itself processes 60% of those imports. You have a major loss of infrastructure that connects everything: medical supplies, food supplies, anything that Lebanon actually needs.
So daily protests have followed the explosion in August. Are these protests, in your view of things, are they different in character than the protests we spoke about last year when you were on the show?
I'll talk about the protest movement more in broader terms, kind of since October of last year. I divide it into two phases. You'd have the first phase, which was very kind of Carnivalesque, I'd say, very festive, very comradely, which is great. It was able to mobilize a lot of people. But then, as repression from the state increased, as well as the economic situation worsened, you started having more, I don't like to use the word maybe outbursts, but more displays of more direct action, of more violence against state institutions as well as banks. I have called this as a process of kind of proletarization of the movement. But then obviously you had to deal with COVID, and as soon as COVID was confirmed in Lebanon, there was the start of an emergency law, and this included the mobilization of the army into the streets. Obviously, the state used COVID as an excuse, but while the army was mobilizing for our health and safety, the health and safety of the Lebanese people, they also made it a point to clear out what was left of protest tents, protest encampments, and roadblocks. So essentially, they used it as a suppressive tool, and this has carried on. We have seen reinvigorated movements and protests over a short period, sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3 days, sometimes just a day. And every time they have come out with a stronger kind of character of direct action and confrontation. So, for example, in the weekend after the blast happened, we saw new forms of direct action, such as the direct occupation of government buildings, as well as attempts to storm the parliament.
Yeah, I've seen some video online of skirmishes in the street between protesters and security forces. So they actually tried to storm a government building?
So they succeeded in occupying a few ministries. These occupations didn't last long, but I'd say this is a marked escalation because this is not something we've seen before. Before, where we have seen it, it was mostly demonstrations outside of these buildings or the occupation maybe of municipal buildings, but not national institutions. So you have seen this, but there remains a big issue of confusion within the movement due to a lack of leadership, due to a lack of political program. So the demands or really remain in a negative kind of sense. So they remain demands of what we don't want. There isn't a positive program yet, and it seems that the movement is hitting up on a sort of limit. I don't want to sound pessimistic about this. Obviously, movements move in kind of cycles. So I'm not kind of writing the movement off, which is something a lot of writers did as early as when they started in October of last year. But I am pointing to weaknesses or issues that the movement does need to overcome. I'll also point out that the economic situation in Lebanon continues to deteriorate. You're now talking about 22% of the population is now marked as in extreme poverty, and 45% of the population is below the poverty line. So, we will still be looking at changes in the movement and hopefully the emergence of a positive political program.
I think it's important for people to know that this isn't just like a country where poverty has been a constant. There's been a worsening.
To kind of point to this deterioration, as a lot of this poverty is also tied to the currency crisis that Lebanon is having. So because of the devaluation of the currency, the unofficial devaluation of the currency, the central bank has not yet changed the exchange rate. There's been an inflation rate of more than 400%. So that is a big factor of why we're seeing these large growth of poverty.
So 400% means that what you would pay a year ago, you're paying 4 times that amount right now.
Yes.
And that's the average. Have wages and salaries kept up to any degree?
No, they have not. And because of this economic crisis, you are also having a growth in unemployment, or pay cuts and all of that. So it's kind of on all fronts. There is no reprieve.
Right. So that means that since their wages are not keeping up, their food budget has quadrupled. It's taking 4 times as much a chunk out of their total pay as it did a year ago.
Exactly. Yeah. There's reports of supermarkets no longer even printing prices because they'll have to change them the next day.
So last time we spoke, Jade, we talked about Lebanon's severe indebtedness and how that shapes so much of the politics, and also how that situation of extreme debt is in some ways the product of Lebanon's confessional system, right?
So what this has created is a situation where the state itself is used as a tool to siphon off government funds as well as build clientelist networks to benefit these different sects and their parties, followers or members. This has also linked itself with the banking system in Lebanon. So most of the commercial banks that I was just speaking about are also owned or by either these politicians directly or their family or their close contacts. And most of Lebanon's debt is actually owed to these banks, which the government kind of took money from them at an exorbitant interest rate. So, just this is a multitude of ways in which, there is no line between public and private in Lebanon, and they all belong to that same sphere of the ruling class parties. It's worth also saying that each of these parties have their kind of international backers, one of them being France. France also has a big colonial history in Lebanon. So Lebanon was a French, in quotations, mandate country. So it was a kind of a colony of France from World War I onwards, essentially, until Lebanon's independence in the 40s. So now you've seen this kind of re-emergence of the figure of Macron as Lebanon's savior, showing up immediately after the blast, wagging his finger at the politicians. But at the end of the day, it's worth noting Macron didn't show up on his own. He showed up with business leaders, French business leaders, because they're trying to put a bid in on running the port and reconstructing and running it. And the new prime minister of Lebanon, who's now trying to form a government, has ties with a previous prime minister who's very powerful in the northern city of Tripoli, that is also a port city, where a French company has the rights of running that port. So Macron's visit is being presented as some kind of friendly interventionist on behalf of the people to make sure that the government enacts these reforms. But what these reforms mean to unlock foreign aid and foreign investment as well ultimately means the privatization of state assets, which include the port, which include telecom, which include power. And Macron's visit needs to be understood in this lens.
If listeners didn't hear our first interview with Jade Saab back in December, they should go back and check it out. We go into a lot more detail about the confessional system in Lebanon and how that really shapes all the politics in the country. The week after the explosion in August, when it came out that government negligence was to blame, Prime Minister Hassan Diab and his cabinet resigned. This isn't the first time a government has resigned in the face of public pressure. Is there anything different this time?
I mean, not really. Diab kind of served his purpose as being a bulwark of the movement, of being counter-revolutionary. I mean, it's very funny. When he resigned, he went on TV and gave this very, heartfelt, again in quotation, speech about how the forces of the ruling class are beyond him, and he tried to reform, but the system doesn't want to reform, even though he's been involved in government before being a prime minister. So no, this has become a bit of a revolving door. The only difference of the new designated prime minister is the turnaround for his assignment has been ridiculously quick, and this can be seen as a move to appease Macron. But in terms of the content or the character of that person, no, again, he was selected because of his business connections, as I said before, with the ports and just him being palpable enough for the rest of the political parties. So again, I'll say here that the same with Diab as well as most other prime ministers, they were not assigned through the proper consultative, the legal consultative methods that the parliament is supposed to go through to assign a prime minister. All of this happens kind of behind closed doors, backroom deals, and then the parliament meets and votes for someone they had already agreed to vote on. It's again these different ruling parties that are not so much pulling the strings, but kind of making a decision, and then the parliament just enacts that decision.
So basically, the country can select different people, but they're basically just shuffling the deck and selecting different cards from the same deck, and you end up with the same ruling class calling the shots.
Yeah, essentially. And, the only difference I'd say with Diab and this new person is that they were not previously very public faces. I mean, with Diab, the ruling class was able to come out and say, well, see, this is a government of technocrats. They cut the number of seats in government, not in parliament, in actually the ministerial portfolios. And then because they were mostly filled by people who had been in the background before, were able to tell the protest movement that, see, we've met your demands, two of their demands being a technocratic, independent, and smaller government. So they were able kind of to say, here you go. They threw some pieces of bread at us and tried to get us to quiet down. And for some, it's worked. For many, they've been, well, maybe we should give this government a chance. And obviously, after this disaster that happened in the port, it's just becoming increasingly clear that, it is just a shuffling of a deck of cards.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you're already starting to answer this, but the response of the protest movement to this sort of reshuffling, what do you see happening with demands and people's understanding of what sort of things should be demanded? We were talking back in December about people demanding the end to the confessional system altogether. Is that still a demand that's on the table?
I think there is an understanding that the only way to get past these problems is the end of this confessional system. The confusion that comes out is how. Back in October, of last year, when the protest movement started, there were the main kind of requests or demands were the resignation of the government, the formation of a smaller technocratic government with legislative authority so that they can pass a new non-sectarian electoral law, and then hold early parliamentary elections. And this was actually a process or demands built on what is allowed within the Lebanese constitution. But what this means essentially is you're asking for your own oppressor to implement your own conditions of reform and your own demands. And, the ruling class is not going to be its own executioner. So that's where the movement continues to be stuck. The demands are still there in terms of building a secular state, but where it's stuck is, all right, how do we get about getting this? How do we build the power needed to be able to confront the ruling class? And it is worth again saying that although there were big protest movements, it's unknown how many people still back the sectarian system, how many people still see it as something that preserves their existence. It is an existential issue for a lot of people because you're in a country with so many minorities. Everyone sees themselves as a minority, and therefore they don't want their representation in government being taken away. That's kind of how it's seen. So there's still a big question about where is the balance of power, as well as how can this power be built to directly confront the government. You've had this dance all over again after the explosion of all these parties blaming each other for the explosion or for the negligence of the explosion and for the corruption, and everyone coming out and saying, oh, we're not corrupt, they're corrupt, we had nothing to do with this. Which is absolutely incredible. I mean, to give you an example, the ruling coalition in government right now, it continues this myth of them having no control and of not being able to push forward any real legislation or real reform, even though they are the majority in the parliament. So it's a complete sham, and this carries back to the main slogan that came out of the protest back in October. All of them means all of them. So I feel there is this understanding, and it is spreading this understanding that it is an entire ruling class, an entire system that needs to be tackled, not just in in the seats of government, because that's not where their real power is anymore. The real power is not just within the state bureaucracy. It's within this merger of the private and public spheres, where they really have a hold of the entire productive forces of capital in Lebanon. And maybe productive forces is not the right term, because Lebanon doesn't have a very productive economy. It's more a rentier economy, but of the actual capital, they have control of the property, the land, as well as for a large case, control over the people through this sectarian mindset.
So Jade, you seem to indicate that within the protest movement there's a lot of confusion. But I want to know whether that's confusion proper, such that you got a large group of individuals who are confused about what's going on and what to do, or instead maybe it's a movement that is beset by internal contradictions, different views of what the problem is, different ideas about what to do, and it's stalling because it's not working through these internal contradictions.
I think to an extent it's that. It is a simple also due to historical reasons, and we deal with history as we get it. There is a lack of infrastructure around the ability to mobilize. So even if a specific party or group within this movement did come out with a brilliant, positive political program, do they have the material forces to actually mobilize and to confront and to, in many cases, perhaps devolve into an armed conflict, in which we don't. So, traditionally the labor movement, which even in the Middle East, so if you look at the case of Sudan, for example, where the labor movement played a very leading role in the uprising there, in the revolution there, you don't have that in Lebanon. One of the first things the ruling class did after the end of the civil war was set to dismantle the labor movement and co-opt it itself. So you don't have this infrastructure in place to even confront the state or the ruling class in a cohesive way. And it's this that needs to be built. So there are two parts of this fight. One is, an immediate defensive fight against the worsening economic conditions, and the second is setting about building this counter force to the ruling class. And that's something that I think really needs to be highlighted, and is something people on the ground really need to do, because you do have these small groups. And again, to go back in Sudan, you did have these very different small groups, but they were able to come together. There they formed a coalition called the Forces of Freedom and Change. They were able to come together, put together a political program, and are now in a strong negotiating position with the military government there, and are in a power sharing agreement with the military there. Lebanon obviously has different conditions, but this is something that we should be looking to emulate, while at the same time building local centers of power and building on direct action to deal defensively with these very dire economic circumstances. And this can be, be it occupations, redistributions, squatting, all these types of forms of direct actions that can help alleviate and build mutual aid and push forward this political idea, then that's what should be done.
And how widely shared is the view that you've just put forward?
I don't think it is. It's something I think in the article I wrote previously, you really started having these new political formations in 2005, and they really started coalescing in 2011. But even in 2011, they still had a big voting perspective. The focus was on electoral politics. It's now very difficult to see that how is this ruling class that is willing to, openly kill us, not just through this economic crisis, but by storing and mismanaging these explosives, and then, blaming each other again for not allowing the other person to do proper work. Very unlikely that they're going to be moved through electoral politics. I don't think we've reached that stage of radicalism where we've completely abandoned the electoral road to reform or change. I think those groups that have adopted that position are still small.
So when people are confronted with ideas like yours about what needs to happen at this moment, what is the response?
The big one is kind of just a cynicism. I mean, that's a big kind of, if I can call it a virus in Lebanon. And I understand where it comes from because Lebanon has been through so much. Just the belief in the ability of change itself is one that's not commonly found. So that in and of itself. There's also arguments that are, correct in positioning, but at the end of the day, defeatist is, what will we do in the event that there is a political collapse and these parties no longer have the state in whichever form it exists to kind of hide behind and go back to perhaps openly fighting each other as they have during the Civil War, or worse off, the fact that there are armed factions within the ruling class that have had no problem historically or during this movement in violently suppressing protests and attacking protesters, as well as we've seen an increased role of the army in doing that. So there is this again, this imbalance of power in building that power in a grassroots kind of on the streets method takes a lot of time, a lot of trust, a lot of barriers to overcome. So that's why you end up having people maybe leaning too much on international intervention. Unfortunately, when Macron visited, you had a lot of people, a lot maybe is an overstatement, but you have certain sections of society arguing for Lebanon to return to become a colonized state again by the French. So you have various kind of mentalities that need to be unraveled, and you need a very direct and close relation to people to be able to walk them through these contradictions, these varied viewpoints, and ultimately sectarianism itself.
So I take it you think that there's some justification in people's fear that a direct challenge at this moment to the system could unleash a bloodbath.
It's not even that. It's that we don't have the power for a direct confrontation. Like the idea of having a direct confrontation right now is untenable. The biggest confrontation we've had was the uprising in last October, and the ruling class has had no problem riding that wave. Similarly, as to this explosion, which is by any standards in any other countries, you'd have mass resignations. Only a few members of parliament have resigned, and the government is now refusing to hold by-elections due to, they're citing the economic situation and security situation, etc. So they're now even using the protest movement to stock up, to shore up resources and as an excuse to not do their basic kind of function of holding elections, even if they were sham elections, which they were.
So I'm now somewhat confused as to what it is that you are advocating, because I thought that you were advocating a direct challenge on the ground to the current system.
Well, I'm advocating that we need to start building towards that, and that it is only through the process of building that we can then lose kind of these defeatist ideas that have been embedded in us.
What does it mean to build to that or toward that?
Well, for me, it would be building first, be it local committees within neighborhoods, within cities, and to take direct action and direct action in terms of occupying empty spaces, housing, or starting to maybe redistribute some foodstuff, some food supplies. I think there is a space there where the ruling class will not see that yet as a direct confrontation. So I think there is a very small space where that action, although it is direct action, can be framed in a defensive narrative, which is what it is, in which any kind of intervention from the state itself will put it in an even more ridiculous position. On top of that, I do think that this needs to be coordinated by a coalition of these various small parties that have been emerging, the small movements that have been emerging, to set who should be helping in building this. And a big part of that is the ability to tap into the international community. And I don't mean here the international community as in foreign governments, but the large immigrant community, Lebanese immigrant community that is outside, that is living outside. And we've seen how they've responded to this explosion at the port, and how much money they've been able to mobilize, and how much pressure they've been able to put on the state from outside themselves. If this can also be focused and put into use in a political sense, because all of that money has now gone into NGOs who hold a kind of apolitical stance, who only intervene in a humanitarian sense. If all of that was being funneled with a political program, then that's you're building that power both externally as well as internally on the ground by having a support as well as a leadership for direct action in smaller localities.
The problem I see are these two poles of this is a set of defensive actions versus this is a way of trying to build a counterpower. And I have doubts whether you can have it both ways, right? Especially because the government is going to be looking at it, and you're saying, well, maybe they'll view this as, not a threat to their power. But what about if it succeeds? And I think that you would be regarding success as building a counterpower or potential power, rather than just making people's lives better and acting in a defensive way. The moment the powers that move from, okay, well, these people are just trying to get some food distribution going, we don't have to worry about this in terms of our own power. The moment they move from that to, we do have to worry about this in terms of our own power, what happens to this counterpower that you've supposedly been building?
Yeah, let me clarify here. Maybe I misspoke or didn't structure it. I think the government will see it as a direct challenge. I don't think they'll be able to immediately try to demobilize something like that, because it would put them in a more difficult position. So I think in that sense they will be stuck, and I would argue that it is through the dealing with the immediate material conditions of the people on the ground that you can help them as well, and explain to them, help them lose kind of both their defeatist or their cynical perspectives, as well as move them away from the sectarian system and the sectarian ideology that's been pushed by the ruling class. So I at the end of the day, we are talking on a showdown of some sort, whether or not this power is allowed, as you point out, whether or not we can build this power. There remains that question of how do you then change that power, be it either into state power, into the old demands, putting together a new smaller government that can enact a new electoral law. So it's not a program. What I'm suggesting is not an A to Z program, but it is, I think, a way in which we can maneuver to begin building that power that is necessary to enact whatever program we're going to want to enact, because it is going to depend on that power. And the way the counter-revolution reacts to that is something that will then have to be dealt with on the spot.
Before we conclude this interview, we're just going to take a few moments to hear from Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing and all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist-Humanism. Please join us.
One of the central problems in the revolutionary movement, it seems to me, for a very long time, has been this idea of trying to gain power and making that the focus and not thinking about what happens thereafter. This is the problematic that Raya Dunayevskaya, founder of Marxist-Humanism, made absolutely central. She'd call it the question of what happens after the revolution, or even for short, what happens after. And the idea is that a tremendous number of failures have occurred because all of these questions about what would be required, what it will take, what will be the obstacles in the process of creating something new, they get put on the back burner in the interest of building power, and then when the time comes, the movement is unprepared to grapple with the problems that it confronts. And it seems to me that this inability to grapple with these questions and refusal to grapple with them became codified as an ideology with people like the late David Graeber. So that, you're talking about something very, very minor in terms of a setback in the broad, historical scope of things. They occupied a square close to Wall Street, and then when the city government wanted to clear them out, the city government just cleared them out, and that was the end of occupied Wall Street, and they never recovered. So this idea that you can just work things out as you go along through experimentation, and especially the idea that you can leave theory aside and not have that be an integral in philosophy, what you're struggling for, and not work that out, but just build institutions and alleged sites of counterpower. It seems to me that this has been tried again and again, and it's been more and more codified, but that it hasn't worked. And even worse, the fact that it hasn't worked has not led to any major rethinking of that kind of mentality, and that's what I find most distressful of all, that something is happening whereby I think people are so concerned with issues of control and power and building alliances and having massive numbers of people that they're willing to do what it takes to make that happen, to let ideological differences slide, to not have theoretical questions worked out because they might be divisive. And what they're doing, it seems to me, is setting themselves up for defeat when they face obstacles or confrontations or, the co-optation of people. All kinds of things come along. And it seems to me the most important thing that one has to organize, one as an individual and one as a movement, you have to organize your own thinking. And so that process of discussion, of theorization, of having that become public, widespread, not just, behind closed doors, but in the mass movement itself, it seems to me that that's hugely important and needs to be taken into consideration. And this other stuff, you can look like you're building a lot of things. And then it, like with Occupy, it just collapses when it's pushed on.
I'll start by saying I 100% agree with you. These conversations need to be had. The question is who's, we don't even have someone to have these conversations. So that's where the movement kind of is at this stage. It's still trying to find itself, and actors within the movement is still trying to find itself. And even those actors who have a battle plan, so to speak, do not have the ability to mobilize people to enact their plan. So that's an aspect of it. And a second part of it is, I don't think it's up to me to kind of come up with that plan. This is something that I would argue needs to happen within these sites of contention that also need to be built. So I don't see it as a way if there's a theoretical part where we all, different parts get around the table and we decide, okay, this is the plan, and then go out and implement it. There is this dialectical process that's happening as the movement itself unfolds. And the reason it's happening so late and it is so underdeveloped are because of historical reasons.
Right. I wasn't talking about formulating a plan either on one's own or by sitting around and negotiating it. It's more a question of the dialogue that needs to be had now and in an ongoing way, so that the movement can form a real unity in terms of what it wants, where it sees itself going, how it's going to operate, and confront the internal divisions within it and the forces outside. I mean, that requires a long and ongoing process of discussion. I'm not saying, you design a plan, right? Not at all. In relationship to what you're saying right now, my question would be, what is the obstacle that is preventing, or what are the obstacles that are preventing, internal and external obstacles preventing different individuals and groups in the movement from engaging in this broad public discussion, and more importantly, seeing to it that process is going to continue?
Yeah, that is the biggest barrier, I would say, of the movement in Lebanon. I'd mark it down to just them being underdeveloped, them being immature movements, as in they're either very, very new. Many of them formed during the last election cycle. So we're talking, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head, 2017. And many that had formed before, for example, starting 2015, are not revolutionary organizations, are purely electoral political organizations. So when confronted with something as daunting as a revolution, which is a daunting project, do not have the politics to cope with it, to deal with it. So that's why I'd say the priority is, and the site of these conversations need to be had as we're working towards building a coalition that can put forward a political program. It is through that process that we will have this ideological clarification that you're talking about, this working through internal contradictions. But at the end of the day, even once that is set, the counter-revolution itself also adjusts forces and changes things on its behalf. And, the quote I keep coming back to is, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, is something that in revolutionary extraordinary situations, you are dealing with just a highly complicated and continuously changing and evolving situation. But to answer your question more directly, I think that discussion needs to be had as specific groups are building towards a coalition. And I don't know that any groups do want to build towards a coalition. The only direct call I've seen to do that has been from the Lebanese Communist Party, but not a lot of people want to work with the Lebanese Communist Party because of their own history, etc. So you are dealing with just historical factors that are getting in the way of this happening, as well as a level of underdevelopment within the movement itself. Going back to the lessons that you were talking about, this idea of, we need to have this, I think people, or certain people in Lebanon are aware of this because we've seen the examples of Egypt, for example, where there wasn't this kind of project and then where it succumbed to, reaction and then the counter-revolution. So I think this is something that people are aware of, and a shameless plug here is part of the intention of me working on that book I've edited is to draw on lessons from other countries in the region and what their experiences have been in building this power and this political program and working through their contradictions.
I just have one question that's nagging on me, because I got a sense from what Jade was saying in the prior episode that a very different sense that I'm getting this time. And the sense I got last time was that he was saying that sectarian identification had greatly eroded, such that people were not hostile to members of other sects of Islam or Christians versus Muslims, whatever it was, at least not the way it had been before, and that was undermining the confessional system, the power-sharing system. This time I'm getting much more of a sense that self-identification in terms of being a member of a particular religious community is much stronger than the sense I got before.
Yeah, I'd say not that it's much stronger. I'd say it's inescapable, because it is built into, to give you an example, my religion, even though I'm not a religious person, is on all my official documents except for my ID. So it's just inescapable in a system sense, even if people are themselves secular. It's just inescapable. A common phrase in Lebanon is, I'm not sectarian, but the system forces me to be. So you live in this kind of duality where, on a personal level, you're not sectarian, but the system forces you to operate in a sectarian way. It's a truism. I mean, a lot of, use this as a joke, but it is also a truism. People who are better off tend to be able to escape this because they don't need to lean on these clientelist networks to secure their material needs. So yeah, I understand how you can see that might be contradictory of what I've previously said. It is, I'd say it's a bit slightly more nuanced. I'd say this concept of all of them means all of them has shown that the only way to overcome this is by overcoming the sectarian system itself. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't remain resistance and resilience of the sectarian system itself. And this is not to build on the way sectarianism intersects as well with class and with another big idea in Lebanon, which is the role of, in quotations, the resistance, the role of Hezbollah as both a state and a non-state actor, which plays very heavily on sectarian rhetoric. So it's a bit of a web to untangle.
Well, we are definitely out of time in this episode, so we're going to have to end the interview. But Jade, thank you so much for this interview. It's been fantastic.
No, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be able to give some insight.
And thank you to our listeners for checking out the podcast. If you like the podcast, please do like the podcast, rate the podcast, leave comments, write to us. If you want to know more about the issues discussed, you can visit Marxist-Humanist Initiative.org.